US Navy has a nuclear submarine that could destroy Russia and China in minutes.
The most deadly of the real-life kaiju prowling the oceans today are the 14 Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, which carry upwards of half of the United States nuclear arsenal on board. The Ohio-class boats may be the most destructive weapon system created by humankind. Each of the 170-meter-long vessels can carry 24 Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which can be fired from underwater to strike at targets more than 7,000 miles away.
All right, good evening, everyone.
Good evening, sir. You all are about to go on some missions that I can't tell you about here on the mess decks. You're in a very dangerous part of the world right now.
As a Trident II re-enters the atmosphere at speeds of up to Mach 24, it splits into up to 8 independent re-entry vehicles, each with a 100 or 475 kiloton nuclear warhead. A full salvo from an Ohio-class submarine, which can be launched in less than 1 minute, could unleash up to 192 nuclear warheads to wipe 24 cities off the map. What possible excuse is there for such monstrous nation-destroying weaponry?
That's a good question to ask again of you, Prime Minister Albanese. What possible excuse could there be for such monstrous nation-destroying weaponry to be used?
Good evening. Australians awoke this morning to a shift in the world order. The federal government moved to very publicly align its defence allegiance with the United States and the United Kingdom. The new defence and security partnership comes with an eye-watering price tag and a shift to nuclear power for the next fleet of submarines. The $90 billion deal with French company Naval Group and the French government has been torn up, and with it, some of the goodwill between the two nations. But the real target of this shift is China. Australia now publicly tying itself to the Biden and Johnson administrations in a move likely to inflame Beijing.
President Biden, joined by the Prime Ministers of the United Kingdom and Australia,
in sync across 3 continents. Leaders broadcasting a joint press conference over afternoon tea, dinner and breakfast.
Well, good morning from Australia.
With a global message.
Today we're taking another historic step to deepen and formalize cooperation among all 3 of our nations.
The first task of this partnership will be to help Australia acquire a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines.
The future of the Indo-Pacific will impact all our futures.
Now trilaterally tightly bound.
Thank you, Boris, and I want to thank that fellow down under. Thank you very much, pal.
A new diplomatic club has been launched.
And so, friends, AUKUS is born.
AUKUS. It sounds strange and all these acronyms, but it's a good one.
Nuclear submarines were top of the agenda for Defence Minister Richard Marles during a series of high-level meetings in Washington. Mr Marles says he had constructive talks with the US National Security Advisor before meeting Defence Secretary Lloyd Austin in the Pentagon.
Yes, we do live in a world with bullies, people who want to exert undue influence over others. But again, I think we need to get away from the hypocrisy and not look at this as just those people, the enemy, doing this. I think we need to hold up a mirror and look at ourselves as well. You know, Rod Holt what role has the United States played in wars since the Second World War? The United States is virtually never at peace. So can the United States preach about the need for peace? And the answer to that would be no, probably they can't. Can Australia preach about the need for peace? Well, Australia has done some very, very good things, and yet when Australia goes to join every US war, practically without exception, without considering the merits of that war, without considering is this really going to help peace or is it not, then we've got a lot of thinking to do about our own role, and Australia could do a lot more to promoting a more peaceful world.
Good evening. Australia is about to embark on a 3 decades-long mission to build a sovereign nuclear-powered submarine fleet, one of the most expensive programs in the nation's history. In a joint media appearance with Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, the US and UK leaders have delivered public backing to share their tightly controlled nuclear capability secrets in order to make it happen. The next phase of the AUKUS Pact means Australia will buy 3 existing Virginia-class submarines from the US, pending approval from Congress, with an option to buy another 2. Australia and the UK will also work on a joint design of a new class of submarine, the next class for both countries. The cost? Up to $368 billion over the next 30 years.
America's defensive scale measured in layers of military might. Sailors adorning 3 nuclear submarines and a missile destroyer, paving the way for the leaders' podium finish.
As we stand at the inflection point in history, the United States can ask for no better partners in the Indo-Pacific, where so much of our shared future will be written.
Whatever the challenges ahead, the cause of peace and freedom that we share will prevail.
3 democracies that are coming together again to fulfill that higher purpose of maintaining freedom, peace, and security.
We all have laid on us today a duty to be prepared, to be strong. Not with the strength of a bully, but with the strength of a deliverer. The world needs the United States of America. The world needs the British peoples of the world. The world needs every scrap of democratic strength. May all that you stand for, and that we stand for, be preserved under the providence of God for the happiness of mankind.
While still maintaining its traditional links with Mother England, Australia firmly aligned itself with the American camp.
Today in Australia, Reds openly preach their gospel, flout our laws, and form a growing menace to the future of this country. Does that disturb you? It should. Let us all face the grim facts, like these Australians. United we will stand. Divided, most assuredly we shall fall.
Korea. Vietnam.
Once again, Australia sent troops to fight with the United States. Then Saigon itself was cut off. Thousands gathered at the American embassy trying to get out with the last of their departing allies, driven by rumours of what the North Vietnamese would do when they finally won. Huge bribes were offered to get aboard the departing helicopters. But there were too many people and too few planes. On the aircraft carriers offshore, helicopters worth millions of dollars were ditched to make room for more people. And then the last helicopter left.
Two wars in Iraq.
Light them all up. Come on, fire. Yeah, right. Keep shooting.
I watched it on the TV. Machine guns fire towards the ground. I watched the people run. Helicopter gunship strafing the street. I watched them lining up the bodies.
Alright, you're clear. I'm just trying to find targets.
In the Baghdad heat. They say these leaks had consequences, and I must agree.
Got a bunch of bodies laying there.
When I saw them fire on the children,
Alright, we got about 8 individuals.
it affected me.
Hey, you request permission to
"20 years in Afghanistan. 20 years in Afghanistan.
Oh my God, he's fallen. Oh my God, he's fallen.
It's been 20 years since a US-led coalition ousted the Taliban in 2001 following the 9/11 attacks. 41 Australians were killed on operational deployments to Afghanistan. 454 British personnel lost their lives, and almost 2,300 US troops have died. During that time, more than 120,000 Afghan military, police and civilians have lost their lives.
Albo, when will we ever learn?
Hundreds packed inside this jet. As the strong clung to an air bridge, the increasingly distraught tried to scale airport walls.
The Prime Minister has also lashed out at the militant group after it said Australian soldiers who were killed during fighting in Afghanistan had died in vain.
It's sickening and it's untrue, but I'm not surprised about a dishonourable statement from the Taliban.
Albo, when will we ever learn?
Whatever the challenges ahead, the cause of peace and freedom that we share will prevail.
Well, the nuclear submarines is just a symptom of this whole ongoing problem of our alliance with the United States and more or less doing whatever is in the perceived to be in the United States' interest. And yes, indeed, Australia's neighbours, especially Indonesia, are deeply concerned about the prospect of nuclear submarines for Australia and the possibility of an arms race within our region. And they're concerned for very good reason, because the nuclear submarines are highly destabilising, provocative, and they are a very significant nuclear weapons proliferation risk.
It's designed to counter China, but Indonesia doesn't like the idea of nuclear-powered submarines patrolling its neighbourhood.
The central pillar of Australian security remains its alliance with the United States.
The AUKUS arrangements with our allies in the United States and the UK will serve the interests of our three nations.
About what is the best option for Australia, we are very mindful that it would be advantageous to be operating a submarine which is being operated elsewhere as well.
It's all very well to say that the United States reinforcement of Australia's defence capability enhances our sovereignty, but that is only if Australia actually retains truly effective and independent command of Australian armed forces.
If you're going to have anything approaching an individual defence, independent is a better way to put it, defence policy or foreign policy, you must be able to keep your equipment separate. You can't do all your training based on the idea that all the forces are integrated, etc. It's too late the day that the war's about to start, say no, we don't want to be in it. You've got to say from the beginning, we will not engage in any wars of aggression, because that's against the UN Charter, it's against the Anzac Treaty. Of course, no one seems to care, but you are breaking the law every time you put troops into say, in Vietnam or Iraq like that. That's a breach of the Anzac Treaty.
We have no reason to believe we can actually operate these boats. I mean, this is a nuclear-powered submarine has a nuclear reactor in it. Australia has almost no experience of operating nuclear reactors, no experience at all of operating them in this kind of setting. And the demands on the Royal Australian Navy to try and get these things to work, well, put it this way, the risk that we don't get it right, the risk that we can't operate them effectively, and therefore that even the boats we have won't be able to get to sea, won't be able to fight effectively, is very high. So I think it's a classic example that the Navy, the government, is going for something sort of exactly glitzy and glamorous and sounds great, but in terms of practically delivering real military capability, it makes no sense at all.
There is apparently no argument in the Defence Department that what we need to do is to build nuclear-powered submarines which can sail a long way for a long time, and their only rational strategic utility is helping the Americans in a war against China.
Not even Peter Dutton, when he was Defence Minister, said that he expected China to try and occupy Australia. Well, that being the case, you've got to ease back a bit how they're a threat to Australia, in what sense they're a threat, and why are we building so much military equipment and trying to get nuclear submarines and that to stand off China and be involved in a war with China.
14 Pacific delegates attended the historic two-day summit in Washington, agreeing climate change is the region's highest priority. The US has pledged to invest more than $860 million in the Pacific.
The security of America, quite frankly, and the world depends on your security and the security of the Pacific Islands, and I really mean that.
Analysts say the deal is a way for the US to counter China's influence in the Pacific after Beijing signed a security pact with Solomon Islands earlier this year.
The whole thing about the South Pacific, for example, what worries them immensely is climate change, and we're going up there filling their ear about, oh, you must be worried about China, you've got to be worried about China. And then all this stuff about, oh, China wants to have a military base there or a naval base there, it is of no military interest. That would be of no military interest to it. It can't protect the supply lines that's so far away from China. The Americans have got several bases in other islands up there, and they, and planes as well as submarines and everything, they could destroy any base that the Chinese put in very, very quickly. But we're determined to keep trying to leak that could be used as a base.
It's big power politics, it's about dominance, and frankly it looks quite racist. 3 Anglo nations encircling China. It's hard to see it in terms that are in terms other than racism.
China has shown no interest. There's not one single shred of evidence that China wants to invade Australia. So why on earth would we consider getting involved with the Yanks in another of their follies with our biggest trading partner?
Climate change is the main economic and security challenge for the island countries of the Pacific.
We won't have nuclear missiles, but we'll have missiles that could be part of an American attack on China.
Submersion ship, dive I. Dive. Dive.
These are very complicated pieces of cyber engineering and physical engineering, and they're very costly, and they're made by a very small number of companies. We know already that the French-built submarines were to have American combat systems because we want them to be interoperable with the American Navy. They would be built by Lockheed Martin. There are only 2 or 3 other companies in the world that could come near to producing this. Lockheed Martin is the biggest armaments company in the world. It's one of the major nuclear weapons suppliers. But we know that we have one of the problems even in the American political system, let alone in ours, that governments have very little control over the way those companies produce defence products. And so we can expect the costs will just rise and balloon.
The federal government says it's working to get billions of dollars worth of delayed defence projects back on track. At least 28 major programs are cumulatively a century behind schedule, and 18 are over budget.
The amount of money we're spending on military equipment is just insane at the moment. There's so much overlapping and so on. It's a lot easier to work out what you need to spend on defending Australia than in trying to build a forward defence thing which is supposed to protect you. Well, so was the Singapore British Naval Base, and that didn't work out too well, and the Japanese bloody took it over very soon. And these submarines are meant to be a similar form to that of being up there.
We could buy 25 really good conventionally powered submarines for the price we'll pay, we hope to pay, for 8 nuclear powered submarines. We get 3 times as many submarines. And numbers really matter. You know, the more boats you have out there, the more of the other guy's ships you're going to sink, the more damage you'll do to him. So the fact that nuclear submarines are so expensive and therefore drive down the numbers we can afford is a really big issue. Now, the government often says the first boat will be delivered sometime around 2040, but the first boat doesn't matter because one boat isn't a capability. We need, and we know this, we need 6 boats. 6 boats is the absolute minimum viable operational capability. And on the very most optimistic estimates, we won't have 6 boats until the middle of the 2050s. Now, the fact is that the strategic contest over the future of Asia will be long over by then. And we're in very grave danger of facing the most dangerous decades we've seen since the 1940s without any submarine capability at all.
Is there an argument for some interim submarine capability? And is that interim submarine capability just interim, or is it what we actually really need in reality if we have a rational assessment of credible defence contingencies? What other defence capabilities do we not build with that 100, 200 billion or possibly $500 billion submarine cost? And how do those unfunded defence capabilities leave us vulnerable? More to say nothing of our social security systems.
The military threat posed by China has prompted a dramatic review of the nation's defences. It's recommending a fundamental overhaul of Australia's approach to deal with the urgent risk of conflict. The Albanese government commissioned the review and has agreed to many of the recommendations. They've now been publicly unveiled, including a major investment in long-range missiles.
Propelling the nation into the missile age as Labor releases a declassified version of the Defence Strategic Review.
This represents a document for today and tomorrow.
The 110-page report, undertaken by former Defence Minister Stephen Smith and former Defence Chief Sir Angus Houston, provides a sense of urgency, finding the Defence Force is not ready to deal with the increased threat of conflict in the region as a result of China's massive military build-up.
In the circumstances that we now face, that defence posture is no longer fit for purpose.
Focusing on 6 priority areas, including the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines and larger missile strike range.
We then have to think about the really serious question of how do we handle nuclear safety issues, not just at sea, and submarines have a bad history, nuclear submarines have a bad history of sinking or burning up. We also have to think about nuclear submarines in Australian ports. You have a fire at Garden Island, who knows? We have no nuclear safety regulatory capability. We do not have the engineering capabilities. We do not have the long-haul nuclear engineering, nuclear safety capabilities in our universities, in our defence colleges. Even if you think that's all a good idea, things go wrong. The list of nuclear accidents isn't just about 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl or Fukushima. There are dozens of major nuclear accidents, most of them through technological fail or human error.
The extent to which Australia acquiring nuclear-powered submarines, which we're told are going to be fueled with highly enriched uranium, which is nuclear bomb fuel, what is that going to do to the non-proliferation regime? And the answer is it's going to be very, very bad in terms of nuclear weapons proliferation. So our neighbours are deeply concerned.
Good evening. China has threatened to use all necessary measures to achieve the reunification of mainland China and Taiwan. In the waters off Taiwan, China is carrying out its biggest live fire drills to date, starting in the wake of US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and showing no signs of easing. All week, the Australian government had been careful not to comment on the Speaker's visit, but on Friday, Foreign Minister Penny Wong did comment on these drills, joining her US and Japanese counterparts in labelling them disproportionate and destabilising.
From the trajectory of the development of Chinese military technology and Chinese scientific technology, that by 2040, 2050, Australian submarines planning to sail through Indonesian waters up through the Philippines and the South China Sea to the East China Sea to sit outside Shanghai are going to be facing a very different underwater surveillance balance than what exists at present.
The White House has condemned China's escalating military drills around Taiwan as provocative and irresponsible. The large-scale drills today entered a 4th day, with Taipei accusing Beijing of rehearsing for an all-out assault. And Australia's being drawn into the dispute too.
What we are calling for right now is a de-escalation of tension. That's what we need to see. It's obviously where Australia's national interest lies.
Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest, you know. We have no alliance with Taipei. None.
This arrangement would witness a further dramatic loss of Australian sovereignty as material dependency on the United States robbed Australia of any freedom or choice in any engagement Australia may deem appropriate.
In the end, to win a war against China, you have to occupy the place. And that means trying to invade it would have an unbelievable death toll for the troops involved, and then you'd have to spend the next 100 years fighting a guerrilla war. You know, it's just insane to think about invading China, and the people doing the attacking can't just always choose, well look, we'll only do the parts of the war we might find easy. How do you finally say that China is defeated?
We have no idea what the strategic environment is East Asia and Southeast Asia will be like by 2040, 2050. Will those submarines even be a rational answer to any strategic problem at that time? And will they be anything other than a suicide activity for Australian sailors?
Expansion of China's economy to the point where it is now the major trading partner of most countries in the world, and its increasing propensity to do deals with other countries outside of the United States dollar as the medium of exchange poses a vital challenge to the primacy of the US dollar. And that, I think, is the real motivation behind the current hostility towards China and the narrative that China is a threat.
I think America will always remain the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, but the idea of America as the dominant power in East Asia, as the dominant power globally, as the leading power in the Middle East and Europe, I don't think that would survive. None of that would survive the loss of a war with China over Taiwan.
The build-up of Australia's military offensive capabilities, particularly with the eventual nuclear power submarines, but also with things like the B-52s and eventually the more modern nuclear capable bombers being based in Australia, is all part of the process of preparing Australia to be the protagonist on behalf of the United States in a war against China. In other words, if they cannot get Taiwan to be the proxy or the patsy, then it will be Australia.
The US are fighting a proxy war. Russia reacted to the Ukrainian president's US visit, saying it shows neither Kiev nor Washington wants peace.
The White House, in a press briefing on the 25th of January, before the invasion actually occurred, said that United States actions in concert with the European allies would be aimed at weakening Russia to the point where it would no longer be able to exert influence on the international stage. So that, in a sense, was the goal that the United States set for the war in Ukraine, was the crippling of Russia.
We've reaffirmed that our Article 5 commitment is sacred, and an attack on one is an attack on all, and we will defend every inch of NATO territory. Every inch of NATO territory.
That is the prime directive, if anybody is familiar with Star Trek. The prime directive as far as United States policymakers are concerned, is, and has always been since the end of the Cold War, that the United States must prevent the rise of any power in the world that could challenge the position of the United States as the top dog.
We want to show the...
It was also important that they crippled Europe as well, because Western Europe was becoming an alternative pole of power through Russia as its main source of energy. The symbiotic relationship between Russia and Western Europe was something that had to be countered if the United States was to maintain its supremacy in the world.
Ukrainian medics risk their lives to save an injured soldier. The battleground is said to be littered with bodies, and it's estimated more than 500 civilians remain trapped there.
70-year-old Valentina left the town of Kursk, south of Lysychansk. She says 11 people died of starvation.
Security cameras capturing Monday's strikes on a shopping mall in central Kremenchuk.
I just want to see my children and grandchildren.
This is what the merciless bombardment of a city looks like.
I think has been demonstrated quite clearly in the case of Ukraine. The United States is always willing to sacrifice an ally in support of its own objectives. Henry Kissinger said, "To be an enemy of the United States is dangerous. To be a friend of the United States is fatal."
Australia, while not a NATO member, is considered a key partner in the Asia-Pacific, as the alliance looks to counter not only the Russian threat, but the challenge posed by China. Anthony Albanese drawing a link between the two.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, came in just after the arrangement was made of a special relationship between Russia and China.
I think it's certainly true that we're now seeing Australia thinking back, we saw it under Morrison, to that idea of Australia as a deputy sheriff that was so clear under Howard. More importantly, we went all the way with the Americans in their two enormous and very self-damaging wars of choice in the Middle East and oriented our whole defence policy around them.
Iraq and Afghanistan.
In Iraq and Afghanistan. And these were disasters certainly for Australia, but certainly for the United States and, of course, for those two countries themselves.
The US is Australia's vital security ally. It's our closest global partner.
We're more effective when we stand and work together.
More of that work to be done in Australia, with confirmation of increased American military rotations. Australia's AUKUS deal for nuclear-powered submarines also discussed behind closed doors.
China's dangerous and coercive actions throughout the Indo-Pacific, including around Taiwan, toward the Pacific Island countries, and in the East and South China Seas, threaten regional peace and stability.
We face a world in which the strategic environment is as complex and precarious, really, as at any point since the end of the Second World War.
What Putin's doing is dreadful, but I certainly hope there won't be the same number of casualties or deaths as have occurred in some of the wars we've been involved in, including 3 million civilians were killed in the Korean War. Terrible things happened to both civilians and soldiers in the Vietnam War, including napalm and various poisons like dioxin, etc., which still exist in the waterways. And the mothers are looking after babies with terrible, deformed big bodies and so forth, and in great pain. And
like with depleted uranium that was used in Iraq as well.
Yes, and the other thing that happens, staying with the Vietnam one thing, is the Americans made no attempt, till a belated attempt, under the last Democrat president, to give any help at all to the people who are the victims of a lot of these things, including the dioxin in particular. The Vietnam War was posed as part of foreign defence for Australia. It stopped them coming down here. Well, the Vietnamese actually won that war, and they've shown no sign of coming down here, taking over Australia.
Russia and Ukraine are both claiming hundreds of enemy troops have been killed in the past 24 hours in the fight for Bakhmut. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky declared that Russian troops suffered more than 1,000 losses in less than a week, while Russia says more than 220 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed across the whole of the front line in a single day.
A warming of the weather and a new enemy. Slushy, coagulated mud. Navigation hard, not only for heavy war machines, but also for ferrying wounded soldiers in makeshift ambulances.
35 в залежності від погодних умов і в залежності від навантаження. І ще буває, що якщо в нас дуже важкий поранений, треба повільно їхати.
Менш ніж за один тиждень, за час із 6 березня, і лише на одному бахмутському напрямку вдалося знищити більше 1100 солдатів ворога. Це безповоротні втрати Росії, втрати саме там, під Бахмутом.
These new recruits who are preparing for major spring offensives in the coming weeks by both sides. Edmund Roy, SBS World News.
What's happening now is a noticeable increase in propaganda from all sides, and we're engaging in it along with America and Britain and so forth, and it's to the point you don't know what to believe. In the Ukraine, for example, I can't know whether what half is put out is true. I'm willingly to believe that the Russians are quite indiscriminate about how they kill and so forth. We don't know that everyone on the side of the Ukraine is a saint, including the president, who people have had to be reminded by the Panama Papers, which were leaked papers about who have been depositing a lot of money there on tax avoidance, and he the president, and his cohorts, the Ukrainian oligarchs and that, he's right up there, up into his armpits into it, you know.
Albanese and Richard Marles are desperately trying to maintain what they call the intimacy of the alliance with the United States. Basically, I think what they're saying is we can't afford to get the United States offside. But at the same time, Penny Wong is trying to stabilise the relationship with China. And Albanese is contributing to that effort as well. But there's been no cutting back or slowing down of Australia's preparations for war.
And the buck stops with me.
We hope Australia will view China and our relations rationally and positively.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
Minister Wong raising concerns over China's military expansions in the region.
We want to show the attitude and comprehensively strengthen military training and get ready for war.
will fight like no one has ever fought before.
A pedestrian bridge in Kyiv.
Alba, we're being set up by the Yanks to take the bullet, to cop it, from either China or Russia, just so America can remain the top dog.
Next generation submarine to be called SSN AUKUS. The biggest single investment in Australia's defence capability in all of our history.
And it's an expensive exercise. The bill to taxpayers, analysts have been suggesting between $170 and $200 billion over the life of the program. But the full scale unveiled today forecast to be somewhere between $268 billion and $368 billion.
Just so America can remain the top dog.
US President Joe Biden has approved a huge oil drilling project in Alaska, provoking environmentalists' outrage that it breaks his own promises on climate action. The $12 billion project is about 300 kilometres north of the Arctic Circle and has generated more than 1 million letters of protest to the White House.
The remotest reaches of the United States, but the decision to greenlight oil drilling reverberating far beyond.
Will not just impact Alaska, it will not just impact this country, it'll impact the world.
Energy giant ConocoPhillips has strong local support to drill in the largest single expanse of pristine land in the US. The Willow project will produce up to 180,000 barrels of crude oil per day. That's 600 million barrels over its 30-year lifetime, generating more than 270 million tons of greenhouse gases, equal to adding 2 million cars to the road every year. This was Joe Biden in 2021.
This is the decade we must make decisions that will avoid the worst consequences of the climate crisis.
And after campaigning but failing to stop Willow, this was the response of environmentalists today.
He claims to care not only about the climate crisis, but also about addressing environmental justice and addressing the extinction crisis. And yet this project will exacerbate all three of those crises, and it's infuriating.
Saudi Arabian oil giant Aramco has reported the highest ever annual profit by a publicly listed company, much of it attributed to high energy prices in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Analysts say the $240 billion windfall is critical for the kingdom's plans to expand its influence on global financial and energy markets. Amnesty International has described the profits as shocking.
It is the world's second richest company and largest oil producer. Aramco is pivotal to Saudi Arabia's extensive wealth and power. The state-owned oil giant made a record $240 billion profit last year, a mammoth 47% rise from 2021. It's the latest energy company reporting sky-high numbers after Russia's invasion of Ukraine saw oil prices soar. America's ExxonMobil recorded $84 billion profit, and Britain's Shell with $60 billion.
Scientists are warning the world is on track to warm by 2.4 degrees over the century, the alarming development discussed at the COP26 climate change conference. The new study suggests that even if the 2030 carbon emission reduction goals promised by world leaders are met, the world is still on track for catastrophic warming. Those behind the research are urging governments to set more ambitious targets.
Pakistan blaming wealthy countries for inaction. The country's climate minister taking a swipe at G20 leaders who gathered in Rome just days before COP.
Climate change cannot be wished away by throwing pennies into the Trevi fountain.
7 months after COP26 finished in Glasgow, and the world's leaders tossed a symbolic penny into the wishing well, hoping for the best for the planet, before heading home in their private jets, the people of Pakistan paid dearly for our inaction on climate change.
Our contribution in the destruction of the planet is minimal, yet we suffer the most.
In Mozambique, the past 4 weeks has seen more than a year's worth of rainfall. Scientists are pointing to fossil fuel-driven climate change, making tropical storms stronger.
Good evening. Shocking, sobering and confronting. That's how a long-awaited report into the state of Australia's environment has been described. The 5-year scorecard finds the nation's environment is in what it's called a poor and deteriorating state. In unveiling the report today, Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek announced a new target to protect 30% of Australia's land and oceans by 2030.
A sunburnt country that's bearing the brunt of more and more natural disasters, from the Black Summer bushfires, relentless drought and unprecedented flooding events. Now the State of Environment report painting a bleak picture.
It is a sobering read. In general, most of our environments are in a poor state, and critically, their trajectory is poor as well.
Today, the new Environment Minister sharing that news gathered across the past 5 years.
A difficult, confronting and sometimes depressing story.
Describing the state of the environment as poor and deteriorating. Land temperatures have risen by 1.4 degrees since consistent records began. The nation's biodiversity decimated. Australia has lost more mammal species than any other continent, warning at least 19 ecosystems are on the brink of collapse. Since 2016, some 202 fauna and flora species have been listed as threatened.
The environmental crisis and the biodiversity crisis have been rolling out for some time now, and we really have run out of time.
But not budging on the 2030 emissions reduction target.
On the 43% target, we made a promise to the Australian people. We're going to keep the promise.
Does what this report show you not give you enough of a message to say perhaps we need to reassess this target?
I think this report would give anyone who reads it a very strong message that we need to do better on the environment. We're only going to have one go at this.
If we do not either get very serious regulation of nuclear weapons or we're on the path to their abolition, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as a first step, or very serious restriction of the numbers and functions of nuclear weapons in ways we haven't ever seen, then we are going to be entering a world of global conflict over climate with nuclear weapons.
We will have two great powers that are nuclear armed going head to head. We must have the contest dying down. We must stop egging the United States on. If we don't cooperate, we're finished. That's the long and the short of it. We're finished.
to oppose, for example, the facile adoption of nuclear propulsion for Australian submarines is not only the strategic dangers, helping to contribute to an existential threat to China, not only the fact that it will encourage a nuclear industry in Australia. Without problem, we have very little in the way of nuclear safeguard capacities domestically. But obviously it will open the door to other countries in East Asia and other parts of the world getting the same technology. It will be impossible for the Americans to say, oh no, we're not giving Japan this, we're not giving South Korea this. They're frontline allies against China.
These plans to house nuclear-capable aircraft in the top end have not been announced and were only uncovered by Four Corners in US tender documents. The documents show the US Defence Department is planning to build an aircraft parking apron to accommodate 6 B-52s at Tyndall. In addition, there are detailed designs for the construction of a United States Air Force Squadron Operations Facility and Maintenance Centre at the base. These are to support deployed B-52 squadrons. The US Air Force is also building its own fuel storage tanks and a bunker for ammunition.
Will US nuclear missiles to arm those B-52s be stored here too, at Tyndall?
The ability to deploy United States Air Force bombers to Australia sends a strong message to adversaries about our ability to project lethal air power.
It was America's B-52 bombers which did horrendous damage during the Vietnam War to the civilian population. This is Neil Davis, an Australian news cameraman who covered the Vietnam War for 11 long years. Neil became a legend during the war for his courage and humanity, and how his footage depicted the true nature of war.
I was afraid of the B-52s, the 8-engine bomber used by the Americans. The B-52s carried 30 tons of bombs each. They needed 3 semi-trailers to load one of these bombers. And they flew in an arrow formation, an inverted V if you like, and dropped their bombs, 90 tons in all, simultaneously. Usually from a height where they couldn't be seen, nor could they be heard. So that the first thing the Viet Cong knew on the ground was that they were being obliterated. High explosive bombs meant to shatter deep bunkers, and they were killed either directly on top of the ground or indirectly below when the shock waves surged through those deep bunkers, and they were killed in that way. There were phosphorus bombs included in the load, which set fire to everything on top of the ground. That resulted in, of course, being denied oxygen down below because of fire burning up the oxygen. So it was pretty devastating. I didn't want to be caught in anything like that when I went with the Viet Cong.
As the wind blows, it's just 2 hours flight from Darwin to Alice Springs, and another 27 kilometres drive to Pine Gap, the US military's top secret spy base.
Pine Gap has one very important role in the event of American nuclear war, which is to indicate what are potential targets for an American second strike on China. The infrared satellites that downlink through Pine Gap and through bases in Britain and the United States, but through Pine Gap for our part of the world, they register. They're infrared telescopes basically in space. They register the enormous but very brief heat plume of the launch of a ballistic missile. And the technology is now at the stage from the the launch of the missile for about 10-12 seconds following that heat bloom before it burns out and enters upper levels of the atmosphere and space. The facilities at Pine Gap and what it is connected to in terms of American sensor technology can compute the location of the launch, the time, absolutely precise time of the launch, the trajectory, which can be calculated from projecting from its initial trajectory, and can then inform the American and Japanese missile defence facilities on land and at sea, particularly those at sea, that if those interceptor missiles are then pointed at a particular part of the sky, not the whole sky, but just a very particular part, then their radars have a chance of picking up the incoming Chinese missile and destroying them. That means if it works as advertised, there's a lot of doubt about whether it will, but if it does, for China, that means that suddenly their nuclear deterrent capability is either vitiated or even eliminated almost completely. So China is immensely vulnerable to that, and the Chinese are well aware of that.
Pine Gap is absolutely key to the command and control of United States forces in the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. And Pine Gap, in fact, covers most of the territory of Russia as well.
There's the idea, certainly the Australian governments have talked about publicly since the 1990s, that extended nuclear deterrence, the American nuclear umbrella over Australia, is a shield which will protect us against any nuclear threats. The only problem about that is the United States has not ever said so publicly. There is no written public commitment from the United States.
Australian forces setting out from Australia to fight China in its own territorial waters would have to be stopped before they could get there. So obviously missile attacks on Australian naval and air bases would be on the cards.
Would Pine Gap be targeted?
I think it's almost inevitable that Pine Gap would be targeted.
Dee-dum-dum, dee-dum-dum, there was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert when danger threatened him.
This is a US government film made in 1951 to help Americans deal with the reality if an atomic bomb hit their town or city.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you. Duck and cover.
In the case of China, those 1,800 deployed weapons that the Americans have and another 3,000 or so in the locker ready to go are an order of magnitude bigger than what China has, which is about 350, perhaps 400, something like that. Now, it's not a matter of a seesaw, 400 one side, 1,800 on the other. It's also the fact that the Americans have vastly more sophisticated systems for targeting, for missile defence. Chinese fire-their missiles. American Missile Defence Shield will stop a certain number of those, probably a lot. We don't really know.
We all know the atomic bomb is very dangerous. Now, you and I don't have shells to crawl into like Bert the Turtle, so we have to cover up in our own way. First, you duck, and then you cover. And very tightly, you cover the back of your neck, your face. Duck and cover underneath a table or desk or anything else close by.
This is not just a matter of deterrence. If the Chinese fire several hundred missiles in America, it will be catastrophic for the Americans. But after that, they won't be able to do anything, even if they get through. Not many will get through, because the Americans have the capacity to target Chinese missiles. They can conduct nuclear warfighting operations, partly because Pine Gap.
Duck and cover.
If Russia, for example, wanted to send a signal to the United States, using nuclear weapons as a signalling sound is horrific and awful, but it's certainly part of the plan. And if it wanted to say to the United States, don't go any further, we are really serious about this. One way in which that could be done technically and possibly politically quite effectively. From the Russian point of view, wouldn't to be used a small or a single nuclear attack on a target that the Americans think is important. To do that, they wouldn't want to do something which is so important as to provoke a huge American attack. They certainly wouldn't want to target an American city. One of the most obvious signalling operations that's been considered by Australian nuclear planners, not that we've ever done anything about it, is that Pine Gap would be a very good signalling target with the virtue of destroying part of an American capability, nowhere near a major population centre, an American ally, but not America. Any nuclear attack on Pine Gap, of course, would destroy the facility, but the fire and blast effects on Alice Springs would be horrific.
10 seconds to go. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The mighty power of the atom is unleashed.
We know from the Barralinga and EMU field tests the British conducted in the 1950s that Central Australian and South Australian tests can, under certain circumstances, distribute fallout to Adelaide, Brisbane and other Australian cities.
We must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover. This family knows what to do, just as your own family should. They know that even a thin cloth helps protect them. Even a newspaper can save you from a bad burn. But the most important thing of all is to duck and cover yourself, especially where your clothes do not cover you.
If anything happens to start the nuclear ball rolling, A, it's going to be unstoppable, and B, it's going to be horrific every way around. The most effective way of destroying a base like Pine Gap is not to have a bomb which explodes on the ground, but one that explodes about 500 or 600 metres up. If you think about the pressure as a sphere, you want to optimise the effect in a particular area. This is a horrific way of thinking about part of our country, but it's what's likely to be an airburst rather than a ground burst. Fallout depends on two factors. One is which way is the wind blowing, which depends on the day and the climate at the time. The second is the height of a burst. Fallout, which is not radiation from the bomb itself, but irradiated earth materials when the fireball touches the ground and then lofted up into the sky and then blown somewhere.
Hospitals in the Northern Territory are being overwhelmed by patients, with both facilities in the capital Darwin operating under code yellow. The emergency management response allows for services to be shut down and patients transferred from Darwin to regional centres.
Breathing life into a struggling health system. It's hoped these graduate nurses will boost staffing levels in a system overwhelmed.
If you ever fly into Alice Springs and look out the window, you're very likely to see Pine Gap in the distance. And not only is there a large airport south of Alice Springs now, with perhaps 1,000 people there at any one time, there is also a very large and overcrowded prison with more than 800 inmates at any one time and a comparable number of staff. The housing parts of Alice Springs have expanded towards Pine Gap. So it's the first responsibility of an Australian government is to think about the well-being of Australians, the security of Australians. And so very basic questions about civil defence, about the defensibility of Pine Gap, and it's not defensible, and the value to Australians has to consider the well-being of the people of Alice Springs and the region around it.
attack, for instance, on Pine Gap, Alice Springs. It would be a hard call for the AMA and for the federal government, state territories, to send nurses and doctors into that contaminated situation.
Yes, exactly. When you've got a radioactive, virtually a radioactive wasteland, who's going to want to go there to help out any survivors? But in addition to that, we look at what all the things that health services need to operate. They need communications, transport, clean water, sewage, etc., etc. All their supplies, all of the things which would be virtually destroyed in the event of a nuclear war. So that's it's one of the overwhelming reasons why we say that health services would have very little to offer in the event of a nuclear war. And that was the experience at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The remaining health services there, which were very few, were overwhelmed, and they were reduced to little more than first aid stations, dabbing of wounds and that sort of thing. And
watching people die.
Well, exactly, yeah, exactly, and having very little to ease that death. So that's what would be facing us again in the event of a nuclear war again, except almost certainly on a much, much larger scale than was seen at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, everything one talks about in relation to nuclear weapons is horrific, but nuclear famine, the studies here indicate that in the event of a nuclear war involving only a fraction of the nuclear weapons that exist in the world today, and most of them belong to either the US or Russia, in the event of a nuclear war with just a fraction of the weapons that those countries have, the amount of soot and other particulate matter drawn up into the atmosphere would be so great that there'd be blocking of sunlight, reduction of rainfall, agricultural impacts on the world's main food crops, rice, corn, soy, wheat, with the result being global famine, affecting possibly up to 2 billion people.
When the Prime Minister sits in his chair, when the Foreign Minister sits in her chair, and when the Defence Minister sits in his chair, they speak for the country. Polls show that notwithstanding our concerns or grievances, Australian people do not want to be involved in a conflict between the United States and China. Young people in particular want this country to remain neutral.
Australia's leader Anthony Albanese are framing this collective spend in the billions of dollars as a new dawn for defence and security cooperation at a critical moment in world history. Amid rising tensions with the US, China's President Xi Jinping now issuing renewed warnings about his intention to dramatically boost his nation's defences.
A blunt warning from China's president addressing thousands of delegates at the close of the Communist Party's National People's Congress.
We should strengthen national defence and army modernisation, building the People's Army into a great wall of steel that effectively safeguards national security, sovereignty and development interests.
And the buck stops with me.
relations are actually moving positively.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes. Minister Wong raising concerns over China's military expansions in the region.
We want to show the attitude and comprehensively strengthen military training and get ready for war.
I will fight like no one has ever fought before.
A pedestrian bridge in Kyiv.
From the White House and the office of the President of the United States, we present an address by Dwight D. Eisenhower. This is the farewell address for President Eisenhower, whose 8 years as chief executive come to an end at noon Friday. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. I confess that I laid down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization, which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. A vital element in keeping the peace is our military establishment. Our arms must be mighty, ready for instant action, so that no potential aggressor may be tempted to risk his own destruction.
Australia in recent years has moved away from the great tradition we had. Australia, especially in the UN, was very strong on disarmament and working for peace. We were a big player in getting the arms trade treaty up and running. In more recent times, particularly since the arms industry itself in Australia has been more privatised, there's been the influence of these big corporations coming into our political and public space. And what we now see, unfortunately, are things like goals of being the 10th largest weapons exporter in the world. We are exporting weapons into the world's violent hotspots like the Middle East.
Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience.
But we have been, over a long period of time, a very major customer of the US arms industry.
Australia is a top 5. In fact, we're currently 4th at importing arms, so we're a big customer.
The 4th largest importer of weapons in the world, Australia.
That's right.
A country with 26 million people.
Yes.
What a great record to hold up and be proud of, eh?
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Lockheed Martin, ladies and gentlemen, are the world's largest producer of killing machines.
The representatives of the military-industrial complex of the United States are heavily embedded in Canberra and very influential in defence planning and even in defence decision-making.
They all have access. They have passes to make them lobbyists. Yet we, as Canberra citizens, Australian citizens who've travelled here with our message have to fill in forms. We have to pass security and we're not allowed in anyway. And if we have a strong message, then we're doubly not allowed in. We're not allowed on the forecourt. We're only allowed in the authorised assembly area, which is the green space out the back of Parliament House. No parliamentarians see us there. They don't want this message.
When our leaders talk about the possibility of war with China, do they really have any idea what they're talking about, what it would look like? And we don't just mean what would it look like from the war room, what would the strategies be? We mean what would it look like for the people who suffer the consequences? How many civilians would be involved? What sort of injuries would they have? How many refugees, how many people are likely to be displaced? Who's going to look after all of them? Where would they go? What are the possibilities of escalating to nuclear war, which is a whole different ball game in itself, and possibly terminal for much of the civilization that we know. So those who are blithely talking up the possibility of war with China, do they really have any concept of what they're actually talking about? And one suspects not.
The federal government is spending between $1 and $2 billion on 2 new weapon systems, described as the cutting edge of modern military hardware.
The High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, or HIMARS, allows militaries to shoot and scoot, but its deadly effectiveness goes beyond mere buzzwords. Ukraine credits it with helping to shift the momentum of the war. Australia will get 20 of the Lockheed Martin US-made launchers by 2026 to 2027.
One of the big problems in Australia in this sector is the lack of transparency and the lack of accountability. So we had an example late last year with the new Defence Minister, Richard Marles, who had been given a report that said defence projects, procurement projects are cumulatively a century running behind schedule by a century and $6.5 billion over budget. So he made this announcement and, in my opinion, correctly called it a systemic, serious problem, which it is.
Ministers laying the blame not on the department, but the coalition's handling.
It's a government that was totally focused on press releases and announcements, on hoopla and vaudeville.
But then he immediately moved away from talking about the system and he exonerated the Defence Department and the arms industry from any blame and purely laid the blame at the feet of his political opponents.
So we're just going to remind everybody that Kim Beazley was one of the first architects of the exports, the Australian exports to the region, weapons exports, exports of violence. Beazley went on, after he was the Defence Minister, he went on to be the ambassador of the USA. And it seems that this is part of the revolving doors. If you can get an ambassadorship to the USA or the UK, you are really in a position to do the deals.
The revolving door is something that is a factor in both major political parties, and so as well as high-profile examples, we can see a recent one having been Kim Beazley. He's actually moved through the revolving door a couple of times in his career. The first one was when he came back from being the US ambassador. He joined the board of Lockheed Martin, which is a US, the world's largest weapons maker by a very long way. And at the same time, he was speaking and writing for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which advises government, supposedly independently, advises government on defence and security policy. So he had those two positions going at the same time. And ASPI, this Strategic Policy Institute didn't, to ever, that the ones I saw, declare his position on the Lockheed board.
Let's talk about Lockheed Martin. What we know in Indonesia is that Australia has developed, delivered to Indonesia a bunch of Hercules transport troops, and that these transport troops are being used. We have seen them in West Papua. They're being used to transport troops and militarised equipment into West Papua, where people are actually suffering and dying. And we just want to call out to our friends in West Papua who we see taking action and trying to stop this increased militarisation. And these are some of the people who have been killed: Christianus Liandong and Kaliki Mirip. And so these people are involved with civil resistance, just non-violent activists just like us. And what we find is that they are being killed with the assistance with the weapons of these companies.
Joining me now is business reporter Edward Boyd.
It's profit season in the States, so there were some big companies reporting better than expected profits. The big one was the huge defence company Lockheed Martin. That is really starting to profit from all of the global conflict that's happening at the moment. So apparently their F-35 fighter sales have been strong. That's really pushed up their revenue. I think it was about $17 billion US in revenue in just a 3-month period. So their shares skyrocketed about 9% overnight.
This is what Ukraine got for Christmas. Patriot missiles represent America's most advanced ground-based air defense system. Each missile costs $4 million US. The launchers more than twice that. They require a support crew of nearly 100 soldiers who will need training. That means they're likely to be in action late and will be reserved for large-scale incoming strikes aimed at causing maximum death or damage.
Tomorrow marks 1 year since the invasion began. Ukrainian fighters with Western weapons have exploited the failures of Russia's military planners, but at a heavy cost.
Good evening. It's been 1 year since air raid sirens rang out in cities across Ukraine. 1 year since war returned to Europe after Russian forces launched a pre-dawn invasion in what President Vladimir Putin described as a special military operation. February the 24th is now forever etched in the minds of Ukrainians whose lives changed in an instant. The largest assault on a European country since World War II has killed thousands of civilians. The UN says 8,000 have died, but says the real number is much higher. Western intelligence puts it at 40,000, and the United States estimates that the combined number of military casualties on both sides has passed 200,000. More than 14 million people have been displaced. And as the world marks a year since Russia's lightning assault, the fighting grinds on.
The people of Ukraine are the victims. They have been caught in the middle of a war between the United States and Russia, and neither the United States nor Russia cares about the thousands and thousands of people who have died in Ukraine. But these companies are the ones that are the real winners. Their share price has gone through the roof. They are making billions at the expense of people's lives, livelihoods, and their homes. And they continue to do that. And our government allows them to operate from our soil.
Once weapons were manufactured to fight wars, now it appears that wars are manufactured to sell weapons.
How does that fit into Lockheed Martin, to Boeing, to Raytheon, to Northrop and so on?
Well, all of those ones you've mentioned are either on the board of the Australian Policy Institute upon which Richard Marles has said he implicitly relies for advice. There are also lobbyists for all of those armaments manufacturers who are working as either consultants or advisors to the Australian government with regard to defence procurement and force posture and so on.
We'll visit Brendan Nelson later in the day. Yes. Yeah, don't shade your eyes, shade your eyes. We've got Christopher Pine, former minister, now part of the Albert Systems, NOAA, and the Australian, this is the architect of the Australian Missile Corporation.
Christopher Pine is a recent example that a lot of people would remember. As Defence Minister, he was actually talking with EY, which is a consulting firm, one of the big four in the world, and he, 9 days after leaving Parliament, took a position with them. They have a large defence practice. Having been Defence Minister in Cabinet and talking with them about it while he was still the Defence Minister. So he basically makes a mockery of the ministerial standards, which everyone recognised at the time.
Internal government documents show senior members of the Defence Department were told to publicly dismiss concerns about Christopher Pine's new job as a contractor. The talking points reportedly instructed officials to say what Mr Pine chooses to do post his ministerial employment are not defence issues.
As well as his lobbying firm, Christopher Pine has also now moved on to the boards of various defence-related companies. So there's an Australian one called NIOA, N-I-O-A. It sells ammunition and it's grown quite a lot in recent years. It's now also involved in the Australian Missile Corporation and bidding for the production of missiles here. The Yemen war is little known in Australia, not very much reported. It's been going on since early 2015. I could make an analogy for you. Everyone is quite rightly upset with Russia invading Ukraine. Anyone supplying weapons to Russia is rightly condemned. There's terrible war crimes going on there. On the other side, we have the Yemen war, which has been going on since 2015. The USA has been the major supplier of weaponry into the Saudis, untold war crimes there as well. Something like 3/4 of the population is in need of aid. Children are starving to death for lack of food. It's a really terrible situation, and the US is a big arms supplier there as well as the UK, and as I was saying, our Australian firm is also supplying the Saudis and the UAE.
On August 9th, Zaid's son Osama filmed his class on their long-awaited school trip, a reward for graduating summer school. Within hours, and it had all gone horribly wrong. A plane from the US-backed Saudi-led coalition struck a bus carrying them. Dozens died. Some of the bodies were so mutilated, identification became impossible. All that's left are the scraps of schoolbooks, warped metal, and a single backpack. Munitions experts tell CNN this was a US-made Mark Mk-82 bomb, weighing in at half a ton. The first 5 digits there are the cage number, the commercial and government entity number. This number here denotes Lockheed Martin, one of the top US defense contractors.
In recent years, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has been one of the key and strongest voices in Australia with the increasing rhetoric against China and the huge threat that China apparently presents.
We need to have an army with more hitting power and more range, and that's what these weapons will give it.
Confirming an unclassified version of the Defence Strategic Review will be released before the May budget.
The government can't hide the fact that China is both an important market and the potential aggressor that every other country in the region is worried about. And I think the acid test for government is balancing those two realities.
One of the problems with ASPI is that it's part of its charter is that it's independent of government and the defence organisation. It's supposed to be independent. So when we start having 1, 2 former defence ministers sitting on the governing council, you're calling into question how independent the organisation really is, particularly when it's accepting large amounts of funding from the US government as well as the Australian government. They ought to be also independent of the influence of the arms industry, because the arms industry is so closely enmeshed in this secretive relationship with governments that they can't really be prized apart. So if an organisation such as ASPI wants to maintain the perception, which is what it says in its charter, the perception as well as the reality of its independence, it needs to take heed of that and consider that perhaps being sponsored by arms industry isn't a good idea.
Look at that stranger. Shed me no tear. Shed no tear. Go back to those who sent you here. We are the young they drafted out to wars their folly brought about.
Honourable Prime Minister, look at what we have to forgo. The vital services for millions of ordinary Australians if you and Defence Minister Richard Marles opt to buy 6 to 8 nuclear-powered submarines, the price tag attached that it will inevitably blow out in their lifetime before they have to be carefully decommissioned.
Ready. Still going. Oh, you're ready. You want to stick one of those pillows down the back, please? Elbow. You want to stick one of those? We used to revere our poets, and now we can't wait to shut the book on them. We used to revere our poets. These are the sensitives, and now we can't. They're the ones who know what we're getting up to. These are the sensitives. So they're the ones who know. We found this poem by A.D.H. Hope, one of Australia's great poets of the last century. We found this poem. It's called Inscription for War and was inspired by an anonymous tombstone found at the scene of the battle and was inspired by an anonymous tombstone vastly outnumbered by the invading Persians, ancient Greece. We are the one they drafted out to wars their folly brought about. We are the one they drafted out to wars their folly. Go tell those old men, safe in bed. We took their orders. Go tell those old men, safe in bed. We took their orders. Elbow. Contemplating going to war. Why? Elbow. Contemplating going to war. Why? Elbow. Why?